A woman was removed from her first-class seat without explanation, but what happened just minutes later had the entire crew scrambling and left the flight attendant facing an outcome no one could have predicted. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe for more. The first-class cabin of the airplane buzzed with quiet anticipation as passengers settled into their seats. Among them was a woman with an air of quiet confidence. She stepped aboard wearing a tailored navy blazer, her polished leather bag resting lightly on her shoulder. Her expression was composed, and her posture exuded self-assurance, catching a few curious glances as she made her way down the aisle. She found her seat, placed her belongings in the overhead bin, and settled in, pulling out a slim notebook and pen as the cabin filled around her. The flight attendant on duty moved briskly through the aisle, her sharp eyes scanning each passenger. Her uniform was crisp, her movements precise, but there was something about her presence that felt commanding, almost scrutinizing. She paused briefly when she reached the woman's row, her gaze lingering just a moment too long before continuing her duties. Minutes later, the attendant returned, her demeanor slightly less polished now, her tone firm but professional as she spoke. "Excuse me," she said, standing squarely in front of the passenger. "May I see your ticket, please?" The woman looked up, calm but surprised by the request. Without hesitation, she handed over her boarding pass. The attendant studied it for a moment, her frown deepening as she verified the details. There was nothing out of place, yet her expression tightened. She handed the ticket back with a brief nod, but her gaze lingered as if something about the situation still didn't sit right with her. Despite this, the woman remained composed. She returned to her notes, jotting down something in neat, deliberate handwriting, seemingly unbothered by the exchange. However, the flight attendant wasn't done. After a hushed conversation with another crew member near the galley, she approached again, this time with an unmistakable edge in her voice. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me for a moment." The passenger blinked but complied without argument, gathering her belongings and stepping into the aisle. Other passengers began whispering, their curiosity piqued by the interaction. With every step toward the back of the plane, escorted by the attendant, the weight of judgmental eyes bore down on her. She was led to an economy seat in the crowded middle section, where the attendant gestured for her to sit. "There seems to have been a mistake with your ticket," the attendant said curtly. "We'll have to sort it out later." The woman settled into the cramped space with a quiet dignity, placing her bag under the seat. Her calmness was unnerving, as though the situation unfolding around her wasn't entirely unexpected. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out her phone and began typing a message, her fingers moving quickly but deliberately. When she finished, she tucked the phone away, her expression steady and composed, her eyes focused straight ahead. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers exchanged puzzled glances, some clearly uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. A man seated across the aisle leaned slightly toward the woman. "Excuse me," he whispered. "Is everything all right?" She gave him a faint, polite smile and nodded, saying only, "It's being handled." Meanwhile, back in the first-class section, the flight attendant returned to her duties with a sense of satisfaction. She moved briskly through the aisle, checking on other passengers and offering refreshments, but her thoughts kept drifting to the incident. There was a sense of vindication in her mind, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. To her, the decision to move the woman had felt justified, a matter of instinct. But the lingering unease in her chest suggested otherwise. Unbeknownst to her, a conversation was unfolding in the cockpit. The captain had just received a call from the airline's executive office. "You need to monitor the situation involving a passenger who was moved from first class," the voice on the other end said firmly. "The individual in question is not just any passenger. She's a major shareholder and a key figure on the board." The captain, his expression tightening, nodded grimly and ended the call. As the flight continued, the attendant remained oblivious to the brewing consequences of her actions. She continued to serve drinks and smile politely, her confidence growing with each completed task. But in the economy cabin, the passenger who had been moved sat quietly, her demeanor calm but with an air of control that hinted at something more. Occasionally, her hand would hover over her phone, as if she were waiting for the right moment to act. The tension in the air was palpable, and though most passengers returned to their books and movies, a few cast subtle glances toward the woman. She, however, seemed unfazed, her steady gaze fixed on the seat back in front of her. Something about her quiet poise hinted that she wasn't just another passenger. She was waiting, and she wasn't waiting idly. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, masking the undercurrent of tension that had settled among the passengers. In the economy section, the woman sat with the same calm demeanor, though her eyes occasionally flicked to the front of the plane. She appeared to be observing, calculating, but never betraying her thoughts. Back in the galley, the flight attendant was approached by another crew member, a senior staff member named Dennis. He had been flying for decades and had seen situations like this spiral out of control. His voice was low as he spoke. "What happened with the passenger you moved? The one from first class?" Jessica, the flight attendant, hesitated before answering, her tone defensive. "There was something off about her," she said, folding her arms. "I didn't feel like she belonged in first class. I thought it was a mistake." Dennis frowned, leaning against the counter. "Did she have a valid ticket?" he asked pointedly. Jessica's lips tightened. "Yes, but what?" Dennis interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "If the ticket was valid, you had no reason to move her. You know how strict the policies are about passenger treatment." Jessica shifted uncomfortably, her confidence from earlier starting to waver. "It was just a gut feeling," she muttered. "You weren't there." Dennis sighed and shook his head. "A gut feeling doesn't override policy. You might have just made a mistake you can't fix." Jessica stiffened at his words but said nothing, turning away to focus on rearranging items on a tray. Her mind raced as doubt began to creep in. She didn't like the way Dennis had questioned her judgment. Worse still, she didn't like the way his words lingered, refusing to leave her mind. Meanwhile, in the economy section, the woman calmly picked up her phone. She typed a brief message, her fingers moving with precision. After a moment, she set the phone down and leaned back in her seat, her expression unbothered. Whatever she had set into motion, it was clear she was in control. In first class, Dennis continued to observe Jessica's increasingly rigid movements. Something about her unease made him worry. He had seen this kind of situation before. What started as a small error could escalate into something far bigger than anyone anticipated. And this time, the stakes felt higher than usual. Jessica's unease grew as the flight progressed. She moved through the aisles mechanically, her usual confidence replaced with a growing tension she couldn't quite shake. Passengers in first class seemed quieter now, some whispering to each other, their glances shifting toward her. Dennis, still stationed in the galley, watched her with a furrowed brow, but chose to remain silent. He knew when someone needed space to realize their own mistakes. In the economy section, the woman sat composed, her phone resting silently on her lap. The faint glow of the screen revealed a short message she had sent earlier. "It's time. Let them know." As the flight attendants in first class bustled about, the intercom buzzed with a call from the cockpit. Jessica was the one to answer it. "Jessica speaking," she said, her voice steady but quieter than usual. "Jessica, this is the captain. We need to have a word with you in the galley," came the voice from the other end, calm but with an edge of authority. Jessica's stomach dropped. She muttered a quick acknowledgement and hung up. Her steps felt heavier as she walked to the galley, where Dennis glanced up from a clipboard. The captain stood waiting for her, his expression unreadable. Jessica forced a smile. "Is there something you needed, sir?" The captain crossed his arms. "I just received a call from the executive office regarding a passenger you moved out of first class. Can you explain what happened?" Jessica blinked, her heart sinking further. "There was a mix-up," she said, stumbling over her words. "You thought wrong. The captain interrupted, his tone sharp. "That passenger is one of the airline's most important stakeholders. She holds a position on the board, and her actions today are being closely monitored. Your decision to move her wasn't just a bad call, it was a violation of protocol." Jessica's face drained of color. I didn't know," she stammered. "I was just following my instincts." The captain's frown deepened. "Instincts? That's not how this works. You're expected to treat every passenger with respect, no matter who they are. There's no room for personal judgment here. We'll be addressing this matter once we land." Jessica's chest tightened as the weight of his words sank in. She managed a weak nod before the captain turned and left the galley. Dennis, who had overheard the conversation, shook his head slightly. "I told you," he said quietly. "First-class passengers aren't just regular customers. You've made this a lot worse than it needed to be." Jessica said nothing. Her mind raced, trying to piece together a way to undo the damage. But it was clear the situation was no longer in her hands. In the economy section, the woman sat calmly, watching the clouds drift by outside the window. She tapped her fingers lightly on the armrest, her expression giving nothing away. Whatever storm was brewing, she knew she had already set it in motion. Jessica returned to her duties, but the weight of the captain's words hung heavily on her. Every step she took felt scrutinized, every glance from the passengers a reminder of the escalating situation. Her once steady hands now trembled slightly as she poured drinks, her thoughts a whirlwind of regret and denial. In the economy section, the woman appeared unbothered, her focus seemingly on the in-flight magazine in her hands. Yet her calm was calculated. When a flight attendant approached with a complimentary beverage, the woman accepted it with a polite nod and a quiet, "Thank you." Her composure made her stand out in the otherwise bustling cabin, and passengers around her whispered in hushed tones, speculating about what had transpired. Back in the galley, Dennis approached Jessica again, his voice low but firm. "You need to think about what's coming next," he said, glancing at her pale face. "This isn't something that'll blow over once the flight lands. People like her have influence, and if she's on the board, you've put yourself in serious trouble." Jessica's jaw clenched. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said defensively. "I was just doing my job." Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Doing your job means following the rules, not making snap judgments about who does or doesn't belong in first class. You need to own up to what you did." Jessica didn't respond. Instead, she busied herself with stacking trays, her mind racing. She wanted to believe that this could somehow be resolved quietly, that the woman in economy would let it go. But the captain's stern warning and Dennis's words made that hope feel far-fetched. Meanwhile, the woman discreetly checked her phone again. A single message lit up her screen. "We've alerted the board. Everything is in motion." She placed the phone back in her bag and adjusted her seat, maintaining her calm exterior. To those watching, she was simply another passenger passing the time. But behind the composed facade was someone who had already taken control of the situation. As the flight continued, whispers began to ripple through the cabin. A few first-class passengers had noticed the earlier confrontation and were now piecing together that something larger was unfolding. Jessica could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The once routine flight now felt like a ticking clock, counting down to an inevitable fallout. Despite the tension, the woman never raised her voice or showed anger. She simply sat, waiting, as though she already knew how the rest of the story would play out. And that quiet confidence was beginning to make Jessica more nervous than any confrontation ever could. The tension in the air had become almost tangible. Jessica moved stiffly through the first-class cabin, her usual confidence replaced by a strained politeness that felt fragile, even to her. Every smile she offered seemed forced, every word rehearsed. She avoided making eye contact with Dennis, knowing his disapproval would only add to her growing discomfort. Yet despite her attempts to act as if everything was fine, whispers continued to ripple through the passengers, each one a reminder of the mistake she couldn't take back. In the economy section, the woman remained seated, calm and composed, seemingly detached from the quiet chaos her removal had sparked. She glanced at the time on her watch. a subtle but deliberate motion, as though she were counting down to an event only she knew was coming. Passengers nearby occasionally stole glances at her, curious but hesitant to say anything. One of them, a woman in the adjacent aisle, leaned over and whispered, "What happened back there? Did something go wrong with your ticket?" The question hung in the air, but the woman merely smiled faintly and shook her head. "No mistake," she replied softly, her voice steady. "Sometimes people act before they think." The simplicity of her answer left the other passenger puzzled but silent. There was an authority in the way she spoke, one that discouraged further probing. The woman returned her gaze to the window, her calmness unshaken as the plane cruised at 30,000 feet. Jessica, on the other hand, was far from calm. She could feel the weight of her earlier actions pressing down on her like a physical force. Her mind replayed the interaction in first class, the way she had questioned the woman's ticket, the tone she had used, the assumptions she had made. At the time, it had felt instinctual, like she was upholding some unspoken standard. Now, in hindsight, those instincts felt flimsy and indefensible. The intercom buzzed again, this time with a call directed to the galley. Jessica hesitated before answering, her fingers tightening around the handset. "Jessica speaking," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "This is the captain. The executive office has requested a status update on the situation regarding the passenger you moved. They've made it clear that this needs to be resolved with immediate attention and care. Do not engage with her further unless absolutely necessary. We'll discuss this in detail upon landing." Jessica's heart sank. The formality of the captain's tone was unnerving, and the mention of the executive office only deepened her dread. She placed the handset back on its hook with trembling fingers, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the image of the woman's calm, unwavering expression as she had been led to economy. That composure now felt less like compliance and more like quiet control. Dennis stepped into the galley just as Jessica was composing herself. "Another call?" he asked, folding his arms. Jessica nodded, her expression pale. "The captain said the executive office is involved. They're monitoring everything." Dennis let out a low whistle, his face grim. "That's worse than I thought," he muttered. "If they're watching this closely, you're not just dealing with a complaint. This is turning into something much bigger." Jessica shot him a sharp look, though her voice wavered. "Why are you assuming the worst? Maybe they'll just issue a warning, and that'll be the end of it." Dennis shook his head. "You don't get it, do you? That woman isn't just another passenger. She's on the board. People like her don't let things slide, and they definitely don't sit quietly when they've been humiliated in front of a plane full of people." Jessica's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but deep down she knew Dennis was right. This wasn't something she could smooth over with an apology and a polite smile. The damage was done, and the consequences were already in motion. Meanwhile, the woman remained an island of calm in the economy section. When the younger flight attendant, Clara, approached her with a fresh glass of water, she accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you," her expression warm but unreadable. Clara hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "If there's anything else I can do for you, please let me know," she offered, her tone genuine. The woman glanced at Clara's name tag and gave her a faint smile. "You've been very kind. Thank you." Her voice carried a quiet strength, and the sincerity in her tone left Clara momentarily stunned. As Clara walked away, the woman's calm demeanor didn't waver. Her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, a rhythmic motion that seemed almost intentional. To those watching, she appeared unbothered, as though the earlier incident hadn't rattled her in the slightest. But beneath that calm exterior was someone who understood the weight of the situation better than anyone else on the plane. She wasn't simply waiting, she was anticipating. And Jessica had no idea just how far-reaching the consequences of her actions were about to become. As the plane continued its steady flight, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every small sound, every ding of the call button, every muffled conversation from the passengers seemed amplified in her ears. She moved through the first-class cabin with a stiffness that betrayed her growing anxiety, her thoughts looping over and over on the same question. What happens when we land? Dennis was right, and she knew it. This wasn't just about one bad decision anymore. This was about the power dynamics she had miscalculated so gravely. The woman she had moved wasn't just any passenger. She was someone with influence, someone who wasn't going to let this incident fade quietly. Jessica had spent years in her role, navigating difficult passengers, solving problems, and maintaining control. But now, for the first time, she felt completely out of her depth. In the economy section, the woman's quiet composure remained unbroken. She checked her watch again and reached for her phone, typing another brief message. Final update. They're prepared. Proceed when we land. Sliding the phone back into her bag, she adjusted her posture, sitting tall in her seat. The passengers around her seemed to sense there was more to her than met the eye, but her demeanor discouraged any direct questions. Her calm was unnerving, even to those who didn't know the full story. Jessica couldn't help herself. She glanced toward the back of the plane, her eyes landing on the woman in the cramped middle seat. To her surprise, the woman looked back, her expression unreadable but steady. Jessica quickly turned away, her face flushing. That brief moment of eye contact felt more charged than any confrontation could have been. It wasn't anger in the woman's gaze, it was certainty, as if she already knew the outcome of this ordeal. That certainty unnerved Jessica more than anything else. Meanwhile, the other passengers in first class had begun whispering among themselves. A man in a tailored suit leaned over to his companion. "Did you see what happened earlier?" he asked quietly. "That woman they moved, she didn't look like she belonged in economy." His companion nodded, her brow furrowed. "I noticed. She had a first-class ticket, didn't she? That attendant seemed off about the whole thing." The murmurs grew louder, and Jessica could feel their weight pressing against her like a tidal wave. She couldn't stop herself from glancing at Dennis, who stood at the galley counter, his arms crossed and his expression grim. When their eyes met, he shook his head ever so slightly, his disappointment cutting deeper than words could. Jessica tried to focus on her duties, pouring drinks and handing out refreshments, but her hands betrayed her. A slight tremor caused her to spill a few drops of coffee onto a tray. The passenger raised an eyebrow but said nothing, simply dabbing at the spill with a napkin. Jessica muttered an apology, her voice barely above a whisper, before retreating to the galley. Dennis didn't wait for her to speak. "It's getting worse," he said bluntly, gesturing toward the first-class passengers who were still quietly discussing the earlier incident. "You've lost control of this, Jessica, and if you think it'll stop here, you're fooling yourself." Jessica's eyes burned with frustration. "What am I supposed to do, Dennis?" she snapped. "I can't undo what happened." "No, you can't," Dennis said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But you can stop pretending this will blow over. Face it, you crossed a line. The best thing you can do now is own up to it before it gets worse." Jessica opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. What could she say? Every excuse she had felt hollow, every justification flimsy. Deep down she knew Dennis was right. She had acted on assumptions, not facts, and those assumptions had led her to humiliate someone who had done nothing wrong. Worse still, that someone wasn't powerless, and the ramifications of her actions were already unfolding around her. In the economy section, the woman sat with her legs crossed, her gaze drifting out the window. The clouds stretched endlessly in every direction, a serene backdrop to the tension brewing inside the plane. She appeared perfectly at ease, but her mind was working with precision. She had set the wheels in motion with a single message, and now she was simply watching as everything fell into place. Another flight attendant, Clara, approached her with a hesitant smile. "Ma'am, is there anything else I can get you?" Clara asked softly, her voice kind but tinged with concern. The woman looked up, her expression warm. "I'm fine, thank you. You've been wonderful," she replied. Clara flushed slightly at the compliment, her relief evident. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to let me know," she said before stepping away. Jessica watched this exchange from a distance, her stomach twisting into knots. That woman's poise, her calm demeanor, it was infuriating and terrifying at the same time. Jessica had expected anger, maybe even an outburst, but instead, she was faced with a quiet confidence that suggested something far worse: control. And Jessica had none of it. The weight of Jessica's earlier decisions pressed harder with each passing moment. The whispers in first class, Dennis's sharp words, and the captain's unmistakable disapproval left her with a gnawing realization. This wasn't just a bad judgment call. It was the kind of mistake that could end her career. She tried to stay focused, moving from task to task, but her mind kept returning to the calm, collected figure sitting in economy. Every time Jessica glanced toward her, the woman's unbothered demeanor struck a nerve. It was as though she knew exactly how this story would end, and Jessica was the only one who didn't. In the economy cabin, the woman continued to sit quietly, her focus divided between the clouds outside her window and the faint hum of the phone in her bag. She had been patient, calculating every step, and now the wheels she had set in motion were spinning faster. Occasionally, her fingers would brush the edge of the notebook resting on her lap. It was closed, but there was something deliberate about how she kept it there, as though it were a placeholder for what was yet to come. Passengers nearby had begun to take notice. A man across the aisle, who had been discreetly observing the woman, finally leaned forward and spoke in a hushed tone. "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier. Are you okay? Do you need anything?" The woman turned her head slightly, her expression soft but measured. "That's kind of you to ask," she said evenly. "But no, I don't need anything. Everything is under control." The man hesitated, his curiosity clearly piqued by her composed tone. He opened his mouth to ask more, but something in her calm gaze discouraged him. He nodded and sat back, leaving her to her thoughts. Jessica's nerves continued to fray as the minutes dragged on. She could feel the tension building in the plane, a silent storm waiting to break. Every time she passed through the first-class cabin, she caught snippets of hushed conversations that she knew were about her. She felt the weight of judgment from passengers who had witnessed the incident earlier. Their sidelong glances and disapproving murmurs were like tiny daggers, each one cutting a little deeper into her fragile composure. Her next encounter with Dennis didn't help. He was stationed in the galley, his arms crossed as he watched her approach. "You look like you're about to fall apart," he said bluntly. "You need to pull yourself together." Jessica bristled at his tone. "Do you think I don't know that?" she shot back, her voice low but tense. "I'm doing the best I can." Dennis raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor only adding to her frustration. "The best you can? Jessica, you moved a first-class passenger to economy based on nothing but a feeling. That's not doing your best. That's making a mess and hoping no one notices." Jessica's cheeks flushed with anger and shame. "I didn't know she was connected to the board," she muttered defensively. "That's the point," Dennis replied sharply. "You didn't know anything. You made a snap judgment, and now the whole plane is feeling the fallout. People are talking. The captain is involved. The executive office is watching. You've completely lost control." Jessica glared at him, but his words struck a chord she couldn't ignore. She turned away, muttering something under her breath, and busied herself with rearranging items on a tray. Dennis didn't press further. He had said his piece, and now it was up to Jessica to face the consequences of her actions. In the cockpit, the captain received another call from the executive office. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "We've received confirmation that the passenger, Ms. Lauren Carter, has filed a formal complaint. She's asked for discretion, but we need to be prepared for this to escalate once the flight lands. Keep everything professional, and ensure that Ms. Carter receives a formal apology from the crew before deplaning." The captain acknowledged the instructions, his jaw tightening as he ended the call. He didn't envy Jessica's position. Mistakes like hers were rare but serious, and they had the potential to ripple far beyond a single flight. Meanwhile, Jessica was starting to notice the shift in atmosphere among the passengers. First-class travelers were no longer subtle about their curiosity. A few exchanged knowing glances as Jessica moved through the cabin, their expressions ranging from disapproval to thinly veiled amusement. In economy, passengers whispered about the composed woman seated in the middle section, marveling at her calm, in the face of what many perceived as outright disrespect. Jessica's growing discomfort didn't escape Dennis's notice. He leaned against the counter in the galley, his voice low as he addressed her. "You should probably know this. People are watching you. They've seen enough to figure out something isn't right." Jessica sighed, rubbing her temples. "What am I supposed to do? I can't undo what happened." Dennis shrugged. "No, but you can stop avoiding it. Go back there and talk to her." Jessica stiffened at the suggestion, her stomach nodding. "And say what? That I'm sorry? That I didn't mean it?" Dennis's gaze was steady. "Start with the truth. It's better than doing nothing." Jessica hesitated, her mind racing. She glanced toward the economy cabin where the woman sat quietly, her presence as unshakable as ever. The thought of approaching her filled Jessica with dread, but she couldn't ignore Dennis's words. Avoidance had only made things worse, and now the storm she had been hoping to outrun was about to catch up to her. Jessica stood frozen in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter as though it could anchor her. She wanted to believe that she could still regain control, that the fallout from her decision might somehow be minimized. But each passing moment made it clearer that the situation had slipped beyond her grasp. The murmurs in first class had grown louder, no longer subtle, and Dennis's words gnawed at her. She couldn't avoid this any longer. Her actions demanded a reckoning. From her seat in the economy cabin, Lauren Carter, still poised and calm, watched the activity around her with quiet observation. She didn't need to do much. The wheels were already turning. Each glance cast her way, each whisper exchanged between passengers, was feeding the tension on the flight. This wasn't about revenge for her. It was about accountability. The moment Jessica had singled her out and humiliated her, the flight attendant had inadvertently set the stage for her own undoing. Jessica glanced toward Dennis, who was watching her with a mixture of impatience and disappointment. "If you're not going to fix this, then you might as well stay back here and let it fall apart," he said bluntly. Jessica shot him a glare, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned sharply, straightened her uniform, and began walking toward the economy cabin. Her steps were slower than usual, deliberate, as though she were trying to gather her courage with every step. She ignored the stares of passengers in first class, their conversations pausing as they watched her move toward the back of the plane. Lauren didn't react when she saw Jessica approaching. She remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the notebook in her lap. Jessica stopped a few rows away, taking a deep breath before continuing to the seat. She had prepared herself to face anger, indignation, maybe even a confrontation, but the calm gaze that met her was far more unnerving. Lauren's expression was unreadable, her demeanor composed. Jessica cleared her throat, forcing a small, strained smile. "Ma'am," she began, her voice lower than usual. I wanted to speak with you about what happened earlier." Lauren said nothing at first, tilting her head slightly as she studied Jessica. The silence was unbearable, and Jessica's grip on the back of the seat in front of her tightened. Finally, Lauren spoke, her tone even. "I'm listening." Jessica swallowed hard. "I realize now that I may have acted improperly. Moving you out of first class was a mistake, and I want to apologize for the inconvenience." Lauren raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. "Inconvenience," she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. "You humiliated me in front of a full cabin of passengers. You questioned whether I belonged in a seat I paid for, and you removed me without cause. That's not inconvenience. That's bias." Jessica flinched at the word. Bias. It hung in the air like a blade, sharp and undeniable. She opened her mouth to protest, but Lauren cut her off. "Let me guess," Lauren continued, her tone still calm but carrying an edge now. "You thought you were doing your job. You thought I didn't belong up there because I didn't fit your assumptions about what a first-class passenger looks like. Am I close?" Jessica's face burned. She wanted to argue, to explain herself, but the truth was too glaring to deny. She had assumed, and that assumption had led her to make a decision that now threatened to unravel everything she had worked for. "I didn't mean to offend you," Jessica managed, her voice faltering. "It wasn't personal." Lauren leaned back slightly, her expression unchanging. "It wasn't personal? Tell me, how would you feel if someone made you a target of their instincts in front of an entire room of strangers? If someone undermined you, not because of anything you did, but because of who they thought you weren't?" Jessica's chest tightened. She had no response to that. Every attempt at justification sounded hollow, even to her own ears. She knew Lauren was right. What she had done wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a failure of character. "I'm sorry," Jessica said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what else to say." Lauren's expression softened, but only slightly. "It's not me you owe the biggest apology to," she said. "It's to every person who's ever had to sit in my seat, literally and figuratively, because of someone else's assumptions. You think you're just apologizing to me, but this is about more than you and me." Jessica nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I understand," she murmured. Lauren gave her a long, measured look before speaking again. "For your sake, I hope you do. Because when this plane lands, you're going to understand what it means to face accountability." Jessica's stomach twisted at those words. The calm in Lauren's tone made it clear that this wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Whatever fallout was waiting on the ground, Jessica knew it wouldn't be small. She excused herself quietly and walked back toward the galley, her steps unsteady. Passengers watched her retreat, their curiosity growing. The whispers in the cabin became louder, more pointed. Jessica could feel their eyes on her, could feel the weight of their judgment growing heavier with every step. When she finally reached the galley, she sank into the corner, pressing her hands to her face. Dennis approached her again, his expression grim. "How did it go?" he asked. Jessica shook her head, her voice trembling. "It's bad," she said. "She's not letting this go." Dennis sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You didn't think she would, did you? Someone like her? This isn't just about what you did to her. It's about what it means for everyone like her. You didn't just make a mistake, Jessica. You became the example." Jessica's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to scream, to cry, to disappear entirely, but she couldn't. The plane hadn't landed yet, and she knew that whatever was waiting for her on the ground would make this moment feel insignificant by comparison. The steady hum of the airplane engines was the only constant, as Jessica slumped in the galley, her thoughts racing faster than she could keep up with. She wanted to believe there was still a way to salvage the situation, but every interaction with Lauren Carter had made it clear. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. It wasn't just the woman's calm composure that unnerved her. It was the sheer inevitability of what was to come. Passengers in the first class and economy cabins buzzed with speculation. The earlier confrontation hadn't gone unnoticed, and even those who had been oblivious at first were now catching snippets of conversations. Some whispered about the flight attendant's actions, while others exchanged quiet words about the poised woman who had been moved. The tension was palpable, and the sense that something significant was brewing had infected the entire plane. Lauren, however, sat unmoving. Her body language conveyed a sense of stillness, yet her sharp, watchful eyes hinted at a mind working tirelessly. Every so often she would glance at her watch or retrieve her phone from her bag to type a quick message. She was clearly coordinating something, though she gave no outward indication of what it might be. To those watching, she was calm, composed, and utterly in control. Back in the galley, Dennis approached Jessica again, his expression a mix of concern and exasperation. "You look like you're ready to fall apart," he said, crossing his arms as he leaned against the counter. Jessica looked up at him, her face pale and drawn. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I apologized. I admitted I was wrong. What more can I say?" Dennis's expression hardened slightly. "It's not just about words anymore," he said. You didn't just inconvenience her, Jessica. You embarrassed her, publicly, in front of a cabin full of people. You didn't question anyone else's ticket, just hers. Do you really think an apology is going to fix that? Jessica felt her throat tighten, her frustration bubbling to the surface. I know I messed up, okay? I've been hearing that nonstop, but it's not like I meant to. Dennis cut her off with a sharp look. It doesn't matter what you meant. It matters what you did. And what you did was wrong. Jessica looked away, biting her lip. She hated the way his words stung because she knew they were true. But what could she do now? The damage had already been done. In the cockpit, the captain received another update from the executive office. This time, the voice on the other end was more urgent. The passenger has requested a full formal report on the incident as soon as the flight lands, the caller said. We've been informed that the board is already aware of the situation and will be reviewing it immediately. The captain's grip on the phone tightened. He had been in his role long enough to know that incidents like this rarely ended well for the crew involved. Jessica was in serious trouble, and there was little anyone could do to shield her now. Understood, he replied before ending the call. Jessica wasn't privy to this conversation, but the escalating tension around her was impossible to ignore. When she returned to the first-class cabin, the once polite glances of the passengers had become more pointed. Their hushed whispers felt like accusations, and Jessica could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. She tried to focus on her duties, but her hands trembled as she poured a glass of champagne for one of the passengers. She spilled some onto the tray, and the passenger raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Jessica's face burned as she quickly cleaned the spill and moved to the galley. She couldn't escape the feeling that everyone was watching her, silently condemning her for what she had done. Meanwhile, Lauren sat in the economy cabin, exuding an air of quiet authority. Clara, the younger flight attendant, approached her with a tentative smile. Is there anything else I can get you? Clara asked softly, her voice careful. Lauren looked up, her expression softening slightly. No, thank you, she replied. You've been very kind. Clara lingered for a moment, clearly torn about whether to say more. Finally, she spoke. I just want to say, I'm sorry for what happened earlier. That shouldn't have happened to you. Lauren's gaze flicked to Clara's name tag, then back to her face. Thank you, Clara, she said, her tone measured. It means something to hear that. Clara nodded, her face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and relief. She excused herself and returned to her duties, leaving Lauren alone once again. The plane began its descent, and an announcement came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are stowed. Passengers began to prepare for landing, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Lauren took one last glance at her phone, reading a single message. Everything is ready. The team will meet you at the gate. Jessica overheard a snippet of a conversation as she moved through the cabin. Two passengers were discussing the incident in hushed tones. Did you see how calm she was the entire time? One of them whispered. That's not someone who's going to let this go. She doesn't need to, the other replied. I heard she's connected to the airline's board. That flight attendant doesn't stand a chance. The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. She knew they were right. Whatever awaited her when the plane landed wasn't going to be a simple reprimand. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and now she was about to face the consequences. As the plane touched down and the familiar jolt of landing spread through the cabin, Jessica felt her heart sink further. The descent was over, but her troubles were only beginning. The moment the plane taxied to a stop and the seatbelt sign clicked off, the usual flurry of activity began. Passengers rose from their seats, stretching and pulling down their luggage, filling the cabin with the hum of motion and conversation. But this wasn't an ordinary landing. The tension that had built during the flight lingered in the air like an unspoken truth, weighing on everyone who had witnessed the earlier events. Lauren Carter remained seated, unhurried and calm, as passengers shuffled into the aisle. Her eyes followed Jessica, who had stationed herself near the exit in the first-class section, as was customary for the crew to bid farewell to passengers. Lauren's expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet intensity in her gaze that Jessica couldn't ignore. She could feel it even from a distance, that quiet, unrelenting presence. It was as if Lauren was waiting for the right moment to act. As the first-class passengers began to disembark, Jessica forced herself to smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Each "thank you for flying with us" felt heavier than the last. Every polite nod from the passengers, a reminder of the judgment she felt radiating from them. Some offered her cursory glances. Others looked her up and down, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disdain. One man, the same passenger who had been whispering earlier, lingered just long enough to mutter, "You should have known better," before walking past her. Jessica's cheeks burned, but she bit her tongue, refusing to let her composure crack any further. Her heart pounded as she glanced toward the back of the plane, where Lauren still sat quietly, her hands folded neatly on her lap. The economy passengers were now standing, filing into the aisle in orderly rows. Jessica's stomach twisted as she realized that Lauren would be among them soon, and she had no idea what to expect. Lauren remained seated until the aisle had mostly cleared. She reached into her bag, retrieving her phone and a slim folder that had been tucked away during the flight. Standing gracefully, she adjusted her blazer and stepped into the aisle with the same quiet authority she had exuded throughout the journey. Passengers nearby watched her, some whispering to each other, but Lauren paid them no mind. She walked toward the exit with deliberate, steady steps, the folder tucked securely under one arm. As Lauren approached the first-class section, Jessica felt her breath catch. Her usual script of pleasantries abandoned her as Lauren stopped in front of her, her gaze piercing but calm. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the space between them seemed to shrink under the weight of the unspoken tension. "Thank you for flying with us," Jessica managed to say, her voice strained and trembling. Lauren tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to convey the full weight of her displeasure. "We'll be speaking again very soon," she said, her voice low but firm, her words more a statement of fact than a threat. Then, without waiting for a response, she stepped past Jessica and onto the jet bridge. Jessica stood frozen, her palms damp, her heart racing. The passengers still behind Lauren passed by her without a word, though their glances were heavy with judgment. One woman paused briefly, giving Jessica a look that could only be described as pity before continuing on her way. Jessica swallowed hard, her throat dry as the flow of passengers finally slowed to a trickle. Dennis approached from the galley, his expression unreadable. "That looked painful," he said quietly, his tone more resigned than mocking. Jessica glared at him, though her frustration had no real edge. "She said we'll be speaking again," Jessica muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you think that means?" Dennis shrugged. "It means exactly what it sounds like. She's not done with you, or with this situation, and I doubt the airline is either." Jessica didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was too clouded with the realization of how badly she had misjudged not just Lauren, but the entire situation. She had assumed that her authority as a flight attendant would shield her from scrutiny, that her decisions would be accepted without question. But Lauren had turned the tables with a level of control and composure that Jessica couldn't match. Meanwhile, outside the plane, Lauren was met by a small group of airline staff waiting at the gate. Among them were two executives, their polished suits and serious expressions unmistakable. One of them, a woman with sharp features and a clipboard in hand, stepped forward and extended her hand. "Ms. Carter, thank you for your patience," she said, her tone respectful but professional. "We're here to address the situation you reported." Lauren shook her hand firmly. "I trust you've been fully briefed," she replied, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I expect this to be handled thoroughly. There's no room for this kind of behavior in your organization." The executive nodded. "Of course, we've already begun gathering statements from the crew and passengers. We'll ensure that this is dealt with appropriately." Lauren handed over the folder she had been carrying. "This contains my formal statement along with the messages I sent during the flight. I'll expect a detailed follow-up within the week." The executive took the folder, her expression serious. You have my word, Ms. Carter. As Lauren stepped away from the group, the terminal around her was abuzz with the usual chaos of travelers coming and going. But she moved through it with purpose, her head held high. The events of the flight had been draining, but she felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that she had set the stage for real accountability. What had started as a humiliating moment was now a catalyst for change, and Lauren was determined to see it through to the end. Back on the plane, Jessica stood at the galley, her legs shaky, as the remaining crew began their final checks. Dennis sighed and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's out of your hands now," he said quietly. Jessica nodded numbly, but deep down she knew he was wrong. It wasn't just out of her hands, it was about to crush her entirely. The moment the cabin doors closed behind the last passenger, Jessica felt a suffocating wave of relief, quickly replaced by dread. The murmurs had followed Lauren all the way down the aisle and onto the jet bridge, and Jessica could still hear fragments of conversations floating back to her. She busied herself with the final post-landing checks, trying to distract herself from the tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. But it was no use. The weight of what was coming next pressed down on her like a lead blanket. The captain exited the cockpit, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something more severe. He approached Jessica directly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he spoke in a low, measured tone. "Jessica, stay on the plane for a moment. You're going to need to give a full statement to the ground team before you leave." Jessica's breath caught. "Ground team?" she asked, her voice faltering. "I thought this was just going to be handled later." The captain shook his head, his expression unyielding. "The executive office wants this addressed immediately. They've sent staff to meet the passenger at the gate, and they'll be speaking with you as well. This is bigger than a simple misunderstanding." Jessica felt her stomach churn. "I didn't mean," she started, but the captain cut her off with a sharp look. "Intent doesn't matter right now," he said firmly. "What matters is the impact of your actions. Prepare yourself. This isn't going to be easy." Jessica nodded weakly, her throat too dry to form a response. She glanced over at Dennis, who had overheard the exchange and was now watching her with a grim expression. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said enough. This is the consequence. As the crew finished their post-landing tasks, Jessica noticed that Clara was still near the economy cabin, lingering by one of the empty seats. Clara had been quiet throughout most of the flight, but Jessica could see that the younger attendant was conflicted. She looked like she wanted to say something but didn't know how to begin. Jessica considered approaching her but decided against it. Clara had made her position clear earlier when she showed Lauren kindness, something Jessica hadn't managed to do. The tension on the plane shifted when two airline security officers stepped aboard, their uniforms crisp and their expressions unreadable. They moved with purpose, heading straight for Jessica. She froze as they approached, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "Are you Jessica Porter?" one of the officers asked, his tone neutral but firm. Jessica nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer gestured toward the galley area, motioning for her to follow. "We need to have a word with you about the incident that occurred during the flight. Please step aside." Jessica's legs felt like they were made of lead as she followed the officers. Passengers who were still lingering near the gate craned their necks to watch, their curiosity piqued by the unusual scene. The whispers had become louder now, and Jessica could feel every pair of eyes on her as she moved. She hated the way their stares burned into her back, as if each one carried a judgment she couldn't escape. In the galley, one of the officers pulled out a small notepad while the other began speaking. "We've received reports regarding your handling of a first-class passenger. According to both the passenger and other witnesses, you removed her from her assigned seat despite her valid ticket. Is this accurate?" Jessica swallowed hard, her voice shaky. "Yes, but I didn't mean to." The officer held up a hand, cutting her off. "We'll ask you to explain your reasoning shortly. For now, please confirm whether you verified her ticket before asking her to move." Jessica's face flushed as the realization of her error hit her again. I didn't verify it at first," she admitted quietly. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before turning back to Jessica. "Why not?" Jessica hesitated, her mind racing for an answer that wouldn't make her sound worse. But no matter how she framed it, the truth was inescapable. I thought there had been a mistake," she said finally. "It was an instinct." The officer's expression didn't change. "An instinct?" he repeated, his voice steady but pointed. "Are you aware that your decision not only violated company policy, but also directly humiliated a passenger in front of others?" Jessica's face burned, and she looked down at the floor. "I didn't realize who she was," she murmured, more to herself than to the officers. "It doesn't matter who she was," the officer replied firmly. "You made an assumption that led to a discriminatory action. That passenger didn't deserve to be treated that way, and now you're going to have to answer for it." Jessica felt her legs weaken as the weight of his words settled over her. She had been clinging to the hope that the situation might be salvageable, that her apology to Lauren during the flight might have softened the fallout. But it was clear now that the apology wasn't enough. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The officer continued, "We'll be conducting a formal review of this incident, and you'll be required to submit a detailed written statement. Until then, you're being suspended from duty, effective immediately." Jessica's heart sank. "Suspended?" she repeated, her voice cracking. "Yes," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll receive further instructions from the airline's disciplinary committee. For now, you're free to leave, but we advise you to prepare for a formal hearing in the coming days." Jessica nodded numbly, her mind spinning. The officers stepped back, giving her space to process what had just happened. Dennis, who had been watching from the corner of the galley, approached her cautiously. "Well," he said quietly, his tone devoid of judgment, "it's not the end of the world, but it's going to feel like it for a while." Jessica didn't respond. She couldn't. Her entire career, everything she had worked for, was now hanging by a thread, and she had no one to blame but herself. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave the plane, the weight of what awaited her outside the terminal felt crushing. For the first time, she truly understood what Lauren had meant when she said, "We'll be speaking again very soon." Jessica stepped off the plane and into the terminal, her stomach sinking further with every step. The familiar bustle of travelers moving through the concourse felt surreal, as if she were walking through a world that no longer belonged to her. She clutched her bag tightly, her hands trembling, the weight of her suspension, the disciplinary hearing looming ahead, and the whispers of passengers who had witnessed her fall from grace all pressed heavily on her shoulders. Nearby, Lauren Carter stood near the gate, surrounded by a small team of airline executives and staff. She exuded the same poise she had maintained throughout the flight, her demeanor calm yet commanding. The executives seemed deferential, nodding at her every word, their faces drawn with concern. A few curious onlookers slowed as they passed, trying to make sense of the scene. But Lauren paid them no attention. Her focus remained on the matter at hand. Jessica lingered near the gate exit, unwilling to pass by Lauren and her team, but knowing she couldn't avoid it forever. Her feet felt rooted to the floor as she watched the interaction unfold. Lauren handed one of the executives a folder, her voice low but firm as she spoke. Though Jessica couldn't hear the words, she could tell by the executive's serious expressions that Lauren wasn't making casual requests. She was issuing directives. Jessica felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Dennis standing beside her. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was steady. "You've got to face it sooner or later," he said quietly. Jessica swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What am I supposed to say to her?" she murmured. "What could I possibly do to fix this?" Dennis sighed. "You can't fix it," he said bluntly. "Not right now, but you can own it. That's the only way you're going to get through this." Jessica nodded, though her chest felt heavy with dread. She forced herself to take a step forward, then another, until she was close enough to hear the tail end of Lauren's conversation with the executives. "And I expect this to be handled with the level of seriousness it deserves," Lauren was saying. Her tone was calm but unwavering, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The executives nodded quickly, offering assurances that they would address the situation promptly. Jessica hesitated, unsure of how to interrupt. Lauren noticed her almost immediately, her sharp gaze cutting through the hum of the terminal. For a moment their eyes met, and Jessica felt the full weight of her earlier actions all over again. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Lauren's expression didn't change, but she held up a hand, silently dismissing the executives. They exchanged a few uncertain glances before stepping away, leaving Jessica and Lauren alone in the charged space near the gate. Jessica finally managed to speak, her voice barely audible. "Ms. Carter," she began, her words halting. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." Lauren didn't respond immediately. She studied Jessica for a long moment, her gaze steady and unyielding. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured but carried a weight that made Jessica's stomach twist. "You're sorry," Lauren repeated, as if testing the words. "But do you understand what you're sorry for?" Jessica blinked, caught off guard. I made a mistake," she said, fumbling for the right words. "I shouldn't have moved you. I shouldn't have assumed." Lauren raised an eyebrow, prompting her to continue. Jessica took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I assumed you didn't belong in first class," she admitted, her cheeks burning with shame. "And I was wrong. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. I let my biases get in the way of my judgment." Lauren's expression softened slightly, though it was still unreadable. "Biases," she said quietly. "You're not the first person to act on them, and unfortunately, you won't be the last. But the difference between you and others is that you got caught. Now you have to decide what you're going to do with that." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. "I don't know how to fix this," she said honestly. "I don't even know where to start." Lauren let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. "You start by taking responsibility, not just for what you did, but for how you got there. That means reflecting on why you felt justified in making that decision in the first place. It means educating yourself and making sure this never happens again. Not to me, not to anyone." Jessica nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I will," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes." Lauren's gaze softened further, though she still held an air of authority. "Good," she said simply, "because this isn't just about you and me. It's about everyone else who's ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. You have a chance to change, but it's up to you to take it." With that, Lauren turned and walked away, leaving Jessica standing alone near the gate. The noise of the terminal returned to her ears, the chatter of travelers and the rumble of announcements over the intercom. But Jessica felt like she was in a bubble, her mind replaying Lauren's words over and over. As she walked toward the employee exit, Jessica realized that her career as she knew it might be over. The hearing, the suspension. She couldn't see a way back to the life she had built. But for the first time, she understood that this was bigger than her career. It was about confronting the parts of herself that she had ignored for too long, the ones that had led her to make such a devastating mistake. Lauren, meanwhile, walked through the terminal with her head held high. She had no interest in revenge or retribution. Her goal had always been accountability, not just for herself, but for the systems that allowed moments like this to happen. As she stepped into a waiting car, she felt a quiet sense of resolve. This wasn't the end of the story, but a step toward something better. The ripples of what had happened on that flight would continue, in the airline's policies, in the conversations it sparked, and perhaps most importantly, in the lessons Jessica would carry with her for the rest of her life. And for Lauren, that was enough, for now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a